speakers. So I've asked you all to mute. I'm just going through what I meant to now be reminding you to do. Pop your questions in the chat. I'll see how the times go. We may take questions at the end of each speaker. We may keep them till the end. We will be recording the webinar, so please bear that in mind. And as I've said, if we find that if you lose your connection, just log out, log in again. If we lose the connection, then if we can't get it up and running again in 10 minutes, we'll reschedule. So I think we've had 5 minutes to let everyone in, so I think it's time to begin, otherwise we'll be out of time. So our first speaker is Peter Massini. So Peter is a policymaker, practitioner and thought leader on green infrastructure and urban ecology with over 25 years experience. Welcome, Peter, to the over 25 years experience club. And Peter is going to tell us what is Biodiversity Net Gain.
Okay, thank you, Penelope. It's actually more than 25 years. I just played 25 years to make myself feel a bit younger. I'm just going to share my screen, make sure that everyone can see it. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah, can you make it full screen?
Yeah, I'll make it full screen, yeah. Oops.
Oh, now we're seeing speaker view.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep, excellent.
Yeah, great. So thanks everyone. I'm going to give a quick overview, an ABC of BNG, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, and some of the other speakers will go into a bit more detail about how BNG actually works and what it means to you. So first of all, why is Biodiversity Net Gain being introduced? As many of you know, there's been a steady decline in biodiversity across the country, especially since the 1970s. Much of that is actually a consequence of the intensification of agriculture, but development clearly results in the direct loss of existing habitat, and up until now, often with sort of limited mitigation. So Parliament passed the Environment Act in 2021, which introduced the idea of a mandatory biodiversity net gain. And the intention is that development will result in more or better quality natural habitat than there was before development. So what's its actual purpose? We're very conscious or very aware of the fact about perhaps creating new habitats, but actually its primary purpose is to deter new development from damaging or degrading existing wildlife habitat. And that's because the way the metric works, it creates a disincentive to losing existing habitat. So actually the first part of the BNG approach is to deter development from damaging existing habitat. It also encourages biodiversity to be considered from the outset of development. Again, I think many people who've worked in this sphere for a long time recognise that things like landscape and ecology is often considered once a development has been broadly set out. It actually needs to be thought of from the beginning, and Biodiversity Net Gain really makes that a key consideration. But also it's about how to create or enhance wildlife habitats on site or off site, and it's to compensate for any losses, but also to achieve this overall net gain of at least 10%. When it's become mandatory, it actually becomes mandatory for most major development next Monday, which is pretty soon. But for small sites, not until the 2nd of April. And that's partly because there's a recognition that developers of small sites will just need a bit more time to fully understand the implications of biodiversity net gain. They're less aware of it than some of the bigger developers. For NSIPs, it's not until 2025. And biodiversity net gain, it'll be applied through the attachment of a general planning condition when planning permission is granted. And that will say no development shall commence until a biodiversity net gain plan has been approved by the local planning authority. And the biodiversity net gain plan is something which the developer has to submit to demonstrate they're achieving that 10% net gain. Are there any exemptions? Household development is exempt and permitted development rights. If there's a development where existing habitat is less than 25 square meters or 5 meters of linear habitats like hedgerows, that's also exempt. It's effectively de minimis. And also self-build and custom-built development on small sites is also exempt, and that's primarily because government doesn't want to stifle more innovative approaches to development. So some of the more sort of critical things to sort of get your head around, which is going to be particularly important when you're starting to think about how you determine planning applications. How is it actually calculated? So it's the difference between the value of habitats on site prior to development, that's the baseline biodiversity value, and the value of habitats on site or off site, because you can do off site solutions after development, plus that 10%. It's measured in terms of biodiversity units or habitat units, and there's a statutory biodiversity metric, a spreadsheet effectively, which you use to do the calculation. And the value of the habitats on site, when you're first understanding what you've got on site, is determined by factors such as habitat type, whether it's grassland, woodland, wetland, its distinctiveness, which is effectively an expression of its sort of rarity or specialness. The area clearly has an important role to play. Its condition, and that's a way of determining whether a habitat, you may have a piece of habitat like a woodland, but it could be in very poor condition. It's been messed about with, it's been dumped on, it's not been managed well, or it could be a piece of pristine woodland. So the condition is a factor which changes the score a bit in terms of the quality of the habitat, and also things like strategic significance, which is effectively about its connectivity, where it sits in the landscape. And when you're measuring the post-development value, you use those same determinants plus other factors such as how long it takes the habitats you're creating to reach their target condition, when they actually become valuable habitats. Also things like whether you create habitats in advance of development or post-development, that has an implication on the score. And if you're doing off-site habitat creation, the proximity to the development site. Part of Biodiversity Net Gain is encouraging the Biodiversity Net Gain to be delivered as close to where it's lost as possible. So this is just a very sort of schematic of those pre-development and post-development calculations. So pre-development is primarily the area, that distinctiveness value, the condition and strategic significance, which gives you your baseline units, and post-development, those same factors plus difficulty, time, spatial risk, which gives you your future habitat units. And to get your score, it's the number of habitat units that you will have post-development based on whether you retain habitats on site or create habitats on site or off site, minus that baseline value. And that gives you a net loss or a net gain. I won't go through this because this just gives you a bit more information about how those different terms are defined. Hopefully this presentation will be circulated afterwards so you can get into the detail about how those definitions, how those terms are defined. Importantly, some of those terms or some of those factors are predetermined in the metric. So things like distinctiveness, the rarity or species rich in the habitat, that's predetermined in the metric, depending on the habitat type. Other factors like condition, the ecologist doing the calculation chooses from a menu. So it's not a completely subjective approach, but the ecologist doing the calculation has to take a view on things like condition, or strategic significance and those kind of things. So the metrics are a spreadsheet. It's got some predetermined factors, but it's also got some slightly subjective decisions that the ecologists have to make in terms of getting the score. So what does 10% actually mean? It's important to realise that it's a measure of relative change from the baseline. So I think when BNG is talked about in sort of general terms, some people think it means 10% of the sites that we manage for wildlife, or 10% of, or you've got to create 10% habitat somewhere else. It's the 10% is the relative change from the baseline value. That's quite an important thing to get your head around when you're reviewing applications, because achieving 10% BNG on a site with a very low baseline may actually require quite limited interventions, because 10% of a low number is not very much, whereas 10% biodiversity net gain on a site with extensive areas of semi-natural habitat could require quite costly off-site compensation. So again, it's that relative change which is the key issue. In fact, sites with a zero baseline, i.e. no vegetation on site, are effectively exempt from mandatory biodiversity net gain, because 0 times 10% is 0. So bear in mind, it's that relative change which is the key consideration. How does BNG differ from requiring a landscaping scheme, which many developments have had to deliver in the past? One of the key differences is that the pre-development habitats are taken into account, both in respect of retraining stuff on site if you can, or having to secure that enhanced compensation. So that baseline assessment is crucial. Generally, once BNG becomes mandatory as of next week, the landscaping that might occur on site will have to be richer and more ecologically literate, because you're trying to ensure the ecological value of the site is retained or enhanced, or you have to do something else off-site. Unless the baseline is very low. If the baseline is very low, a good quality landscaping scheme, which you may currently be delivering on a site, could effectively achieve you your biodiversity net gain. The other big difference is that if you're doing off-site habitats or significant on-site habitats, and significance in inverted commas because there's a question mark about what that means on site, but if you're creating habitat on site and it's considered significant, you have to achieve a condition you specify in the metric, and you have to, the developer or their agent, has to manage and maintain that for 30 years. So it's quite a big change from a general landscaping condition, which effectively talks about a 5-year maintenance period. What if it's not possible to deliver BNG on sites? So a key element of the BNG approach is to try and provide new resources for creating or restoring natural habitats in places where that would be the most beneficial thing to do. So part of the BNG process is to create a market in the provision of site habitat units. So if you can't do BNG on site, or the developer can't do BNG on site, they can purchase units from an off-site provider to make up the shortfall. In effect, the off-site provider is creating a habitat bank, and they're selling habitat units to the developer. In those scenarios, the off-site provider takes on the liability for managing those habitats. So if the developer can't do things on site, they can purchase habitats from an off-site provider to make up that shortfall. In the early days, or once BNG becomes mandatory, there's a recognition that that market may not be very mature, and there may not be habitat banks in the local area. And in the interim, developers can actually purchase statutory biodiversity credits. They're effectively a government credit, if you can't purchase those off-site units, these will be priced quite high because they don't want to stifle the market, the development of the market. So just a quick overview about what that might look like. So this is an example from London where I do quite a lot of work. This would have been the sort of typical landscaping scheme a major development might have delivered. Quite nice, but relatively sterile from an ecology point of view. With the advent of BNG, and this is an early sort of example of BNG, that landscape needs to be much more ecologically rich. So a very different approach to how you design and manage landscapes from the point of view of the developer, which requires not only a view in terms of the sort of landscape design to be much more ecologically informed, but also how you ensure your managing agent or your landscape contractors can actually manage those richer, more diverse landscapes, which is quite a different proposition from managing more formal landscapes. But as I said, the BNG approach also is trying to encourage off-site provision and creating habitats elsewhere. So the BNG approach, by encouraging the question of habitat banks, is allowing landowners, farmers, others to take land which is currently of low ecological value, like a piece of agricultural grassland, and actually creating much more rich, ecologically valuable landscapes, which they can sell. They can sell units to a developer who needs them. Thanks. So that's a very quick overview. And I think the next speakers will give you some more information about the details.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Peter. Really informative and very helpful, very clearly setting out, I like the ABC to BNG. I think that's a great thing. There's a question in the chat, but I'm going to hold, Joy, I'm going to hold your question over because I think Sophie will be covering that, because Sophie's talking about habitat banks, and I'm sort of assuming, Sophie, you'll be covering the whole business about enforcing and making sure that 30 years lasts. And if you don't, then we'll come back to the question and someone on the panel, I'm sure, can answer it. Tom is asking, what is to stop developers from destroying habitats on site before applying for planning permission? Yes, let's do with that one, Peter. If you want.
So yeah, that's recognised as a potential problem. So the supporting guidance and the legislation around BNG means that effectively you can't do that because you'll be penalised if you do. If a developer does bring forward a site and they've clearly degraded the site in advance of the application, the baseline value is taken from either January 2020, when effectively legislation started going through Parliament, or at a date agreed by the local planning authority. So yeah, it's not a good idea for developers to clear sites in advance because it won't give them any benefit.
But how do you know what was on the site in 2020?
So, I mean, you can either use things like Google Earth, and you've got a sort of a time mapping history on Google Earth, or the site may have been surveyed in the past if it's a site that's been brought forward in the past. So it's not perfect, but yeah, there are ways in which you can determine what's on site beforehand. And essentially, the ecologist doing that assessment will take the sort of best case scenario. So again, it's not a wise thing for a developer to do, because they'll probably end up having to maybe have to do even more, because you take the sort of best case scenario, what's likely to have been there.
Okay, so that's actually quite a significant change, because those of us who have been in practice for 25 years or more are regularly familiar with the developer going out and trashing the site before they start planning negotiations. So that's a very good outcome of this. And I was also interested that your starting line was that the fundamental purpose of this is deterring people from degrading habitats that are already on site.
Yeah, and just very quickly, it will make, I mean, obviously sites that have already been purchased by developers, they're fixed, but it'll make a lot of the big developers, and now when they're bringing forward their purchasing strategy, will be doing biodiversity net gain assessment before purchase to determine whether actually it's worthwhile purchasing the site. If it's got a high biodiversity value, it may not be a good site to bring forward for development because of the cost of offsetting.
And presumably, therefore, this is something that planning policy teams will be taking into account in allocating sites in local plans and going to the baseline question, I would assume that now part of the evidence for the site will be preparing that baseline so that everybody knows what the starting point is as it goes through that process.
Yeah, exactly.
So Joy is asking a question about each habitat type being subject to gain. Now, I'm going to ask you this question, but it might be Tristan or Julian that you're going to cover this. So Tristan, are you going to be covering this? Okay, so we'll wait till Tristan's done his, and then if necessary, we'll come back, Joy, to yours. And then we've got question, when is it valid from? Does this apply to all relevant applications that are registered after the date, or all valid and running applications regardless of when they're registered? I'm assuming it's the determination date.
It's when the application is made, so after the 12th of February, it's any application made after that date. There's something about section 73, but that's something that the planners will know more about. But
so it might be that I'm applying the wrong rule then. So any application that is submitted after that date, it applies to.
If it's a new application, yeah, but I think that's
quite unusual in planning, because normally the rule comes in and it's applied to all applications that are determined on a certain date, regardless of when it was submitted. So that's we can have two applications running through effectively in parallel, and one it'll be applied to and one it won't.
Tristan might have got a clearer answer.
Tristan's got his hand up. I haven't noticed. Do answer, Tristan.
Just to add, I completely agree, Peter, with how you answered that question. It's my understanding that DCLG and DEFRA had a bit of to and fro about this, to put it politely, before arriving on any applications validated post the introduction.
Okay, well, that's really, really interesting as an old planner, because that is a fundamental change to the way planning operates. And I'm really interested that DEFRA won out on that argument. And let's not go down the rabbit hole of the fact that it's a shame that DEFRA became a separate department. You know, in the old days, we had Department of Environment, and DEFRA would have been part of the planning department in government. And, you know, BNG is a separate legal package. It's separate from the Planning Act, which is a great... Why did we do that? Why didn't we integrate it into the Planning Act? But anyway, let's not get onto that, because we don't want to do that. We're focusing on how we actually implement this. So, Tristan, I think it's a good point to ask you to pick up your presentation, and we'll see there are quite a few questions coming on the chat, which is great, and we'll see which of those fall to you and to others once you've done.
Brilliant, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. I'll start by picking up the question about different habitat types and whether they can compensate for each other. So a crucial point is that there are three sections of the metric: habitats, hedgerows and watercourses. And it's a rule of using the metric that the net gain target has to be met separately in each of those three areas. So for example, a 10% loss in the number of watercourse units cannot be compensated for by an additional 10% gain in habitat units. However, within each of the three sections, taking habitats for example, it is possible to lose one habitat type, for example grassland, and replace it with another habitat type, for example scrub. However, there are a series of rules known as trading rules that limit flexibility in some areas. So where habitats are considered to have low, moderate, high or very high distinctiveness, the flexibility to exchange one habitat type for another reduces as distinctiveness increases. So for example, if you lose high distinctiveness woodland, it needs to be replaced with high distinctiveness woodland. If you lose moderate distinctiveness grassland, it should be replaced by a type of grassland, but there's flexibility over what it is. If you're losing a low distinctiveness habitat, you can replace it with anything. And there will be a weird few quirks that arise out of this. So an obvious one I've encountered a couple of times is arable field margins. Medium distinctiveness in theory need to be compensated for with an arable habitat, but it doesn't happen in practice. So there's going to be a bit of a period feeling out when trading rules are applied strictly and where it's okay to show a little bit of flexibility. But moving on, just as a general point, I'm going to cover a little bit of best practice in different stages of the planning process, but also with a focus on some of the challenges and common problems that occur. So in Oxford City Council, we've had a policy in our local plan requiring net gain for a few years, only 5% for majors on vegetated sites. But as a result, we've been dealing with this for a while, and we've seen where some of the common pitfalls or issues arise. So that's what I'll focus on and try and share. The other points on this slide are really covered by Peter. I just would say, thinking from the very start, what information do we need in support of an application? We do need a copy of the metric as planning authorities, specifically an Excel spreadsheet. There's still a lot of consultants that try and get away with giving you a screenshot in a PDF, but that shouldn't be accepted. A key point is, as Peter was explaining, there are a lot of different factors that affect a score that's assigned to any habitat in a biodiversity metric, and how exactly the habitat is classified and what the condition is assessed to be are crucial. And there are very rigid ways of doing this. So habitat classifications are underpinned by something called the UK HAB system. And there are very specific and technical definitions that separate habitats from one another, including habitats that are quite similar. So, for example, modified grassland is the phrase for the lowest quality grassland you're ever going to get in an application site. It's a couple of species, it's maybe been agriculturally improved, grazed for a long time, there's not a lot going on. What separates that from the next grassland up, other neutral grassland, a bit more distinct, a bit more species rich? And the descriptions in the UK HAB system are very specific, and they also have some very key thresholds. So, for example, species abundance. Other neutral grassland will usually have 9 species per metre squared or greater. So that becomes quite a key number to focus on. And rather than just being told by an ecologist that they've made the assessment and determined what type of grassland it is, it's important for them to show their working and explain how they've reached that. And the same goes with condition assessments. There are very specific criteria for each individual type of habitat that an ecologist has to consider when deciding what condition it's in. We also require baseline and post-development plans showing in UK HAB terms what's there now, what will be there post-development. Now, a key point in terms of the 3 different areas, habitats, hedgerows and watercourses, and needing to deliver 10% in each, is how much harder it is to do it in watercourses. There's a special training that an ecologist has to go to in order to complete a river condition assessment that they don't have to go through to do other areas. And the assessments themselves are very involved, very long, and they require an understanding of aquatic ecology that your average ecological consultant hasn't traditionally had. So in addition to the difficulties of performing the assessment, actually generating a net gain is also rather harder in watercourses than it is in other habitats, such that the level of interventions, for example, changing the use of habitats on the bank top, reprofiling, re-engineering a bank, changing the plants there, intervening in the channel, they can be quite intensive or demanding. And it should be noted that under the metric, it's not only if you're impacting a watercourse that you need to be delivering 10% net gain. If a development site comes forward and its red line falls within the riparian zone of a watercourse, that watercourse needs to be included in the metric and the 10% net gain needs to be achieved. So, for example, if you think of a development adjacent to a priority river, the top line in the table here, and the red line falls 5 meters away from that river needs to be in the metric and that 10% net gain needs to be achieved somehow. And obviously at that point, you'd be trying to do it outside of the red line, which poses a whole range of planning complexities. So watercourses is really something to look out for because it requires, more so than anything else, a really early consideration in the lifespan of a project as to how it's going to be achieved and what the nature of the challenge is. So some common problems. I mentioned the importance of getting accurate and detailed habitat categorizations and condition assessments. These aren't being provided by all ecologists as standard. So this can often lead to a lot of back and forth in the determination period and by extension delays. And I gave the example of modified versus other neutral grassland and the importance of understanding species abundance, so the number of species per metre squared. 3 times in the past month, I've challenged ecologists on this, and their response to how they've determined species abundance was, quote, "We eyeballed it." That's not a detailed enough assessment in the world of net gain. Essentially, anytime a grassland's being assessed, an ecologist needs to be out there with quadrats telling you how many species there are per metre square and how they've come to a value for the site as a whole. There's some flexibility on the methodology they use, but simply eyeballing it isn't acceptable anymore.
Tristan, there may be people on the call who don't know what a quadrat is. Could you just quickly explain?
Imagine a 1 square metre metal frame that you can toss out, and then you can count up the number of species internally within that frame. So a couple of other common problems. Again, I've noted the difficulty of river condition assessments. Actually sharing with authorities how those assessments have been completed is quite complicated. They're undertaken using a platform called Cartographer, and exporting data from there in a legible way is a bit of a challenge. So there's often a bit of backwards and forwards between the LPA ecologist like myself and the ecologist on the project to understand how they've actually arrived at the assessment they've undertaken. I also mentioned how intensive it can be delivering river enhancements, and I think an underappreciated point is that interventions in watercourses will also have other implications for example, flood risk or drainage, and the need to consider those in the planning process, particularly where there are quite intrusive interventions that will need Environment Agency feedback as well. So it's not something that a project team could propose as we intend to do this, and we'll iron out all the details post-condition, because quite likely other stakeholders are going to need an opportunity to express their input during the determination period. And the last one on my list there of a common problem is about the size of the trees proposed for planting in development. So the way trees are valued in the metric is slightly different. The existing, or in the case of proposed trees, projected diameter breast height is used by the metric to spit out a unit value. And depending on the diameter at breast height, there are either small, medium, large, or very large trees. Now, in reality, most trees proposed as part of a development will only be small, that is, have a diameter at breast height of lower than 30 centimetres at the end of the 30-year period. Therefore, in most instances, proposed trees should be down as small in size. However, knocking them up from small to medium sized generates proportionally a very high return in net gain. So it's quite a common trick for constrained sites to suggest they're going to deliver trees larger than they actually are, or then can credibly be approved as a way of inflating net gain score. Now, that perhaps sounds a little bit unfair and critical on my part. In some instances, there is a lack of interface between arboriculturalists and ecologists that leads to a misunderstanding. But I also think it's an area that's people have willfully been turning a bit of a blind eye to, and it's led to a little bit of a gold rush in some instances where people have got away with higher net gain than they probably should have done. The new user guide for the statutory biodiversity metric is much clearer on this point. And I would expect ecologists to be more aware of it moving forwards. A general point on on-site versus off-site and the conflict between the two, there are some pressures that would incentivize the delivery of BNG on-site wherever possible. One of those is financial. Obviously, going off-site can include quite large costs for developers, particularly if they have to purchase statutory credits, which I'll return to later. But in addition to that, there can be political considerations to wanting to ensure that biodiversity isn't exported from urban areas, and we increasingly impoverish cities and large towns at the expense of landscape scale ecological delivery. But on the other side, a very high density development can push back against the ability to deliver net gain on site. After fitting in the number of houses, supporting infrastructure, drainage, open space requirements, certainly in Oxford City, I often find there's not a lot of space left to play around with for net gain. So you'll see the same common types of habitats, other neutral grassland and open space, modified grassland on verges, some green roofs, a bit of street tree planting, over and over again, and there's limited flexibility to do much more than that. So that, on the other side of things, can push people towards offsite. However, the offsetting market, as I think Sophie will be discussing more later, it's not really developed at the rate I think Natural England and DEF are expected. And certainly it's developed patchily throughout England. So in some areas, there are quite a few habitat banks operational. Developers will have options to choose between. In other areas, such as Oxfordshire, it's been slower to develop, which makes it harder to deliver offsetting. And the further afield you go, the more expensive it is, because one thing the metric penalises for proposed habitats is distance from the site itself. Same LPA, no punishment. 1 degree of punishment if you're 1 LPA over, greater punishment the further you go. So the last big release of information relevant to BNG came in November 2023, a much awaited package of guidance, as well as updated regulations and secondary legislation. And there's a couple of things I'm going to draw out briefly. One is, you might now hear the term biodiversity hierarchy, which is a new term introduced to limit impacts on high or very high distinctiveness habitats. Often that's going to bite if a application site has lowland meadow, lowland mixed deciduous woodland on, or priority habitat ponds. It makes it it introduces an incentive to avoid these habitats in the first instance, minimize losses, enhance remaining habitats within the site, deliver those exact same habitats again if that can't be achieved. But the point is that I wanted to get across is it's distinct from the mitigation hierarchy. The idea that you should avoid, mitigate, and as a last resort compensate for impacts on ecology and biodiversity more widely. So if all you take away from this is, if you hear the term biodiversity hierarchy, it's something separate that requires separate consideration from the mitigation hierarchy. In terms of the information required in support of a planning application, the draft PPG on biodiversity, on the face of it, appears to slightly row back on what developers need to give. It had been expected that really everything to do with modelling the baseline, the proposed habitats on site, anything delivered off site would be provided during the determination period of an application. And there's a suggestion now that that's only required for significant on-site gains, raising the prospect that some information can be delayed until post-consent. However, the phrase significant, it's only defined in the guidance released by repeating the word significant. Some examples are given, including, for example, high or medium distinctiveness habitats. But if you unpick that, what that means in practice is the vast majority of developments of application sites will still need to provide everything up front, because pretty much every site is going to include something that's of least moderate distinctiveness and therefore trigger the definition of significant on-site gains. Essentially, a site that's only delivering vegetated gardens and a very small amount of open space may be able to get away with providing less information up front, but that's the minority of applications. I realise I've taken a little bit longer with these slides than I'd intended. I'll just note that where LPAs do have local policies for net gain, such as ourselves, if there's any inconsistencies between the policy and the new framework, the statutory framework will take precedence. So, for example, in our case, we have a 5% net gain. That will be succeeded by the 10% net gain in the statutory framework. But that doesn't mean the policies are fully to be discarded. Our policy expresses a preference as to how offsetting is delivered, and we'll still be applying that to applications. Moving on to post-consent. Actually, I think we'll just, sorry, this is ahead of consent, thinking how things will be secured. On-site gains, the key point, can be secured via planning condition, section 106 or conservation covenant. Now, conservation covenant is a term that requires a responsible body, which can be an LPA or a wildlife charity or even a private organisation who have a certain proportion of their works involved in nature conservation. They can act as a responsible body in order to secure the delivery of certain ecological enhancements. Oxford City Council has not become a responsible body, and I'm not aware of many local planning authorities that have. I think conservation covenant is an idea that may be explored as we sort of get on from the introduction of the statutory framework, but I would expect in most instances planning conditions and Section 106 agreements will be the order of the day, at least at first. Where it comes to offsite gains, the ability to use the condition is lost, and it's Section 106 agreement or conservation covenant. Pre-commencement, Peter talked about the need for a biodiversity gain plan. This is what the general condition for BNG in the Town and Country Planning Act requires the submission of. There is a template plan that's been released by DEFRA that I think a lot of ecologists will probably end up using. They can submit a draft biodiversity gain plan during the determination period. There's no requirement to. However, a lot of the information that's contained in the gain plan, i.e. details of what's being delivered on-site and off-site, will still be required in some other format. So when the biodiversity gain plan has been submitted and approved, the LPA can then discharge the general biodiversity condition. Statutory credits. We've discussed the possibility of providing net gain on-site, off-site, under land under the developer's control or under a third party, or as a very last resort, developer can purchase statutory credits. Now, there is a informational burden that they must meet before they can do this, and this is showing LPA's evidence that they've approached at least 3 offsetting providers in England before credits can be accepted. In practice, because a developer can go countrywide, I would have thought that that's a very, very high bar that makes the purchase of statutory credits a relatively uncommon event. And certainly they've been priced as such to discourage their use because they're extremely expensive. 2 credits is required for every 1 unit that's needed. That goes back to the sort of spatial penalty I was discussing earlier, where if you can't guarantee that compensation will be provided in the same LPA, what you are providing, a penalty is applied to it. So, for example, if an applicant requires 1 unit of grassland to reach their 10% habitat net gain in habitat units, that's 2 grassland credits from central government. That's £84,000. The real kicker is watercourse units. Apologies, that's slightly misworded there. Watercourse credits are a standard £230,000 each. So if a developer requires 1 watercourse unit, that's 460 grand, and that's a lot of money. As a final thought, just looking at monitoring, in addition to a biodiversity gain plan, developers will have to provide a habitat management and monitoring plan that in many respects is going to replace LEMPs on some sites. This plan is what says exactly what management is going to be undertaken for 30 years and how it's going to be monitored. Now, where central government have been quite prescriptive about a lot of elements of net gain, monitoring is an area that has been left largely to the discretion of LPAs, which means there's not a lot of guidance over there on exactly what monitoring is required or expected for any particular habitat type. And this has a lot of implications for, I mean, in terms of DM, negotiating what's acceptable and ensuring consistency within one authority, but ideally between all authorities. I think that's we'll see some convergence, but there's not a lot of help in there in the first instance. But also for landowners looking to promote their sites for offsetting, it makes it quite hard for them to forecast some of the costs involved in doing so if they don't know what monitoring is going to be required by the LPA. There's been a little bit of guidance. The BNG consultation in January 2022 suggested that for a medium-sized project, monitoring might be undertaken in years 2, 5, 10, 20 and 30. What wasn't helpful is that medium size wasn't defined, so your guess is as good as mine. The draft HMMP that was released towards the end of last year included an example of other neutral grassland, but actually rather more monitoring being undertaken. You can see 4th bullet point there, years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 and 30. So the difference between the 2 little bits of guidance we have received is 5 monitoring reports versus 10. Now this is a lot of extra money to be spending. It's additional workload for the local authority. I think most authorities, I expect, will end up charging a fee in Section 106s for reviewing monitoring plans, and that will be per plan submitted. So there's another cost associated there. This will essentially, I think, be worked out in practice. The good news is actually what's required to deliver a lot of common habitats proposed in developments is well known. There's really a set way of delivering the best other neutral grassland, of ensuring urban trees are maintained or replaced where necessary, that green roofs are suitably irrigated, for example. So it should be that convergence will arise relatively quickly, but there'll be a bit of a period of growing pains. I'll leave it there. Happen to answer any questions at all, net gain related.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tristan. A very helpful and very clear presentation to help wrap our heads around this. So let's see what we've got coming up in the chat. There's a question in the chat that I think is asking the height above ground level that the diameter of a tree has to be. Is it 1.3 or 1.5 metres? But it is written in DBH taken at 1.3 or 1.5 AGL in BNG. It's a great question, isn't it? I think I've interpreted it correctly. Tristan, can you answer that one?
I don't think I can, other than saying it is diameter at breast height. I don't know whether that's 1.3 or 1.5 off the top of my head. I believe there are a couple of tree officers on the call if anyone would like to jump in and spare my blushes.
Well, Tristan, it's just that the different conventions are in forestry, it's 1.3 metres, and in arboriculture, like the British Standard, it's 1.5 metres, and this has always caused a bit of a kerfuffle, and I'm wondering whether this is being continues with BNG.
Really interesting. I hadn't realised that forestry was 1.3. I was interested in the question because I thought it was 1.5, but there we are. That shows that I'm a planner and haven't done much rural work. Anyone else?
My gut feeling, if I may, is that because the way that the value of a tree is calculated in the metric, it's a representation of biomass based on the root protection area in a British standard. If that's the same British standard that specifies 1.5 metres, I would have thought that.
That's a good way of getting to the answer. Let's wait for the first High Court challenge around the
intriguing.
just go for 1.4. That'll be fine.
Joy is asking, is there a maximum distance that off-sites can be?
No, it just has to be in England.
In England, not in Wales. So I'm just thinking, if you're in Herefordshire, you can do it in Northumberland, but you can't do it in Pembrokeshire.
I think it's just in England.
Yeah, it would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Kevin is asking, what evidence base should ecologists use to determine the likely DBH of proposed trees after 30 years? DBH being diameter at breast height, but it doesn't have the A in it, which, yeah, okay.
So I believe there's a generally accepted increase in girth year on year from a point of planting that can be turned into an expected diameter at breast height after 30 years. And following that, it's my understanding that as a rough rule of thumb, a tree going in needs to be 19 centimetres diameter at breast height if it's going to achieve the 30 at the point of 30 years. I appreciate there will be species specific and planting location differences, but that rule of thumb is really all that people are working with at the moment.
Is there, again, just asking if there are any arborists on the call, whether they have a more specific answer to that quite specific question? Waiting because someone might be faffing with their mute button. Peter, you're opening your mouth.
Well, I haven't got a specific answer, but I think the whole issue around trees is going to be quite a contentious issue because planting trees, particularly in high density development projects anyway, is quite difficult. And there's a question about issues around girth at breast height, but also about what's the canopy size. And actually a lot of new developments, particularly where I work in London, it's the physical properties of the adjacent buildings which limit canopy size. So, and as Tristan said, if you use the metric and use the helper in the metric, it can vastly overestimate the area of canopy that a tree might achieve, and it makes a bit of a nonsense of some of the proposed habitats if you use that metric, that calculator in the metric. So I think that'll be another thing. There's going to be lots of things that could be tested in court cases over the next 6 months to a year.
It's interesting that so it's not just the diameter of the trunks that's taken into account, it's the spread as well. I'm looking at Tristan, or I'm looking at Peter, either of you.
Well, from an ecology point of view, it's the canopy is probably more important than the girth size. So it's again, I think it's just an issue. It's an issue around how it's measured, and there's not a really good way of measuring the ecological value of an urban tree, to be honest.
Chris Leyland, you've got your hand up. I can't help noticing, Chris, that you're talking about trees and you're called Leyland. But anyway, let's pass on that one. Do you want to tell us what you... Yeah. An
unfortunate namesake and a burden that I've had to live with as a tree officer. Yeah, no, Peter's right. I mean, it is basically a can of worms, this whole projecting forward temporarily diameter and also canopy spread. But I just, as a footnote, the revision of the British Standard 5837 is looking to introduce a section whereby canopy spread growth is projected, albeit in a sort of modelled form, and that might at least introduce a means by which that conflict of can be assessed, whereby you might be generating your BNG units, but you then have to be able to demonstrate the practicality of that on a 2D plan in terms of crown spread. So a sense check essentially.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Could you pop that number in the chat so that other people can take it away and go and look that up? And do you know how quickly that revision is likely to come through?
Yes, it's planned to be 2025, but there may be some wiggle room on that. So it's under review and revision at the moment. Okay.
I wonder if there's anyone on the call from Bucks, because in Bucks, the ex-Wickham district has a policy about canopy cover that was brought in before BNG, or in parallel with BNG, but before BNG was a real thing.
Well, so, Oxford does as well, but what distincts Bucks is that is that I think they have a matrix available whereas Oxford shied away from that mainly because it's another can of worms really, and we essentially asked what we wanted and left it for others to come up with the methodology. Interestingly, a lot of those methodologies went along similar lines because of the parameters that were set.
I was just wondering, is there anyone from Bucks, because they might already have a methodology for dealing with canopy while we're waiting for the British Standard to be revised. Just give a moment for somebody to faff with their mute button. No, I don't think we have. So that might be something that we can pick up across BOBMK and share if there is some learning there. So where else have we got to in the questions on the chat? Can parish councils allocate land within their neighbourhood plan to set land aside for BNG? Would that be something, Sophie, you'd be covering a bit in your... Can we leave that one for your talk?
Yeah, I'm not specifically covering that, but we've obviously seen the green call for sites, and certainly landowners that we're acting for are thinking about whether to put submissions forwards on sort of BNG and other things, but that's left to do with the parish council as such.
Okay. Now, Eleanor, you've got a very long question in the chat. Can I invite you to put your mic on and actually ask your question? Because by the time I try and read that out, I'll prove that I'm not a newsreader.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
You can?
Yes. Hi. I had two questions, and it's from our point of view as landscape architects. The one that I wanted to just ask the panel about was how they're experiencing the day-to-day kind of implementation of BNG on sites. We're finding quite a big pressure in terms of implementing things that get the highest points, so grassland and scrub. And it's meaning that we're creating a whole kind of sequence of spaces and habitats on site that aren't quite what you would imagine would be really high quality ecological thinking. And it's kind of dumbing it down to a kind of paint by numbers approach. And we're actually finding that on a lot of sites. So cumulatively over, you know, is this BNG really having a positive effect from that point of view? And do you think that that will be ironed out through kind of the experience of the metric, and perhaps there'll be, you know, kind of nuances and improvements in that? But I just wanted to flag it because we can't be the only people that are experiencing this. And speaking to other landscape architects and ecologists are saying, we hear what you're saying, but this is what's getting us the points. So yes, I'd love to hear what the panel have to say. Thank you.
Julian, you've got your hand up. Was that in response to this question?
Yeah, it was. Thanks, Penelope. Yeah, Eleanor, yes, this has come up a lot. Bit of a spoiler, I am covering that in my little presentation, so I wonder if we could pick it up there.
Right, excellent. So unless, Tristan, you've got something very specific, should we leave that until Julian's presentation?
I was just going to acknowledge that a consequence of adopting the metric is the homogenization of habitats in a lot of development scenarios. And it becomes a little bit of a question as to whether you think net gain is the right tool to drive the design of green infrastructure delivery, or whether you think there are other standards that should be applied and the net gain is run secondary to that, and the consequences of your green infrastructure approach for net gain is dealt with separately.
That sounds like that could be a whole new subject for a separate webinar. Peter, you've got your hand up.
I just to add to that. I mean, I worked in London for a long time and developed the Urban Greening Factor for London, primarily to try and deal with this issue, the fact that most development sites are actually in urban areas, and those sites have got to deliver other things other than biodiversity, open space, that kind of stuff. And there's quite often a conflict between the biodiversity net gain requirements and those other policy requirements. And so, yeah, it's going to be a lot of head scratching, I think, over the next few months in terms of meeting your biodiversity net gain requirement on site, which many developers want to do, but how that plays against delivering other green infrastructure outcomes, which are perhaps more relevant in some circumstances. So, yeah, it's going to be difficult.
Well, we'll leave that one for a moment. Eleanor, do you want to ask your second question?
Yes, thank you. I think someone helpfully put in an answer to that. So, Mike Barry, thank you.
Well, in which case, in the interest of time, I'll leave that one there.
Thank you.
As we've got an answer. And Nico, yes, there's a technical point. If you've already got outline planning permission before the date that BNG happens, when you put reserve matters in, do you take BNG into account, or is it lost? Does anyone on the panel know?
My understanding is that if outline has been granted prior to the introduction of the statutory framework for BNG, that it will not apply to reserve matters. Reserve matters is not technically a grant of planning permission, so isn't caught by the general condition.
That's very good. That's what I would have thought. But then you see, I would have thought that it would have BNG would have been on determination. So you never know. Great. Thank you very much. So let's, we are a little bit late, but there's lots of questions and it's great to have lots of questions. So Sophie, I'm going to ask you please to lead off. Sophie's from Savills and leads their natural capital team, amongst other things. So going to talk about the market and habitat banks and offsite and all the rest. So thank you, Sophie.
Perfect. Hopefully my slides have come up and it's working smoothly. Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, I work for Savills in our natural capital team and have been working with lots of farmers and landowners who are keen to sort of bring forwards habitat banks. We've covered this already, but really just to say that there is a hierarchy for BNG. Tristan and Peter have done an excellent job at talking about both on-site and off-site BNG. I'm very much focusing on the sort of the off-site delivery, which, as we see on the hierarchy, is the sort of second option after the sort of on-site provision. In terms of the steps we've been going through, this sets it out. We have worked with the ecologists, the likes of Julian and his team, to do the baseline assessments, to identify where the best bit of land might be on certain farms, not only from an ecology perspective, but in terms of the farming side and other conflicted uses on land. Again, then working up with the ecologists, the habitat management and monitoring plans, and submitting those to the council for approval. We are now at stage 4 with quite a few clients, including across the patch that this covers, and trying to get the approvals for the HMMPs, register the sites as and when that registration process becomes possible. And I know with Buckinghamshire, I've gone through the your specific registration process, and then actually trying to take forwards that legal framework phase, which we'll talk about in more detail in due course. We will then get to the implementing of the management plan, but for most of the clients that I'm working with, they are wanting to know that they have sold units first before implementing the habitat changes. So I thought I'd share a case study. This is the Ragley estate in Warwickshire. We reviewed 30 hectares of land, which was constrained by unauthorised public access, archaeology and partial flooding. And as a result of the work that we've been doing, we have looked to rezone it to enable structured public access, flood mitigation and biodiversity provision. I'm showing on the screen the baseline ecology survey, and you could see that it's primarily modified grassland. As a result of the baseline assessment and then working up the habitat management and monitoring plan, we've worked with the estate and the ecologist to carefully think through the site design to maximise both climate and biodiversity benefits. The agricultural grassland is due to be transitioned to a mosaic of species-rich grassland, managed scrub and wetland scrapes. And the result of this is, as shown by these headline statistics, which really comes from the DEFRA metric and the multipliers which make up the calculation of the number of units which we discussed earlier. So this really shows that we've got approximately 119 units, which we are now looking to broker and identify buyers for. In terms of Warwickshire and the legal side of it, we've been working very closely with Warwickshire County Council on this because they were one of the pilot authorities. Initially, because they were rather ahead of the curve, we were looking to formalise this under Section 39 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. But Warwickshire, interestingly, are now wanting to use conservation covenants. And I believe that Warwickshire themselves are in the process of registering as a potential responsible body. So it's a different route to that which we've seen elsewhere, and different to what we're envisaging in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire from my experiences to date. As I say, these units are now available to buy, and so but the works will actually be implemented once we sell sufficient number of units, because the works are being funded through the unit sales. So in terms of BNG considerations, this is really what is, I think, the challenges that are determining how much off-site provision is coming forwards. So demand, fairly key to whether people actually want to create offsite units, is having confidence in the amount of demand that's out there for developers and others to buy the units. We're certainly seeing that it's increasing now that we're moving close to the actual implementation date, but it is location specific. So a lot of landowners are doing reviews to check that there will be the demand in their particular local authority before going ahead. And as this is a nascent market, it will be interesting to see how this settles over the coming year. In terms of supply, we are beginning to see people entering this space. not only developers themselves who are creating their own habitat banks for their portfolios, either via off-site BNG specific land purchases or through creating excess units within certain of their schemes that they can use elsewhere. We're also seeing individual farmers and landowners getting more confident to create habitat banks. For example, we have now got units for sale in Warwickshire, Buckinghamshire, Cherwell. We've got some coming forwards in West Oxfordshire, and we've got plenty of landowners saying we'd be very happy to do a scheme, but we want to know that the buyer is there first. So we've got sort of people who would create a bespoke scheme if we knew that there was the demand there. I think the more clarity we get on some of the points, such as the ones Tristan mentioned around monitoring frequency and therefore cost, together with some of the certainty over how the tax treatment will be handled, is fairly key to unlocking some of this. Because if you keep going back and saying, actually, there's now going to be this extra monitoring cost or increased sort of uncertainty over the future of it, that does deter quite a lot of the individual farmers and landowners. But we're also seeing, as mentioned previously, third-party habitat banks entering the space, so the likes of the Environment Bank, who have bought and leased land between sort of 30 hectare and 500 hectare blocks across England. At present, they don't have habitat banks established in most local planning authorities, but we know that's their objective and they are a significant player in the market. There's a lot of wildlife trusts entering the space, which could actually lead to significant oversupply potentially in certain LPAs. We've been working with a number of housing associations who are also reviewing their portfolios to identify their own BNG needs, but also opportunities to create excess units. And we've also seen some local planning authorities and councils establishing their own habitat banks. For example, we've seen it in Swindon, but also Cambridge. I think the unit values is interesting, and again, that it feels like there's some settling in the sort of figures being bandied around. We've certainly seen a wide range over the last sort of year and 18 months where we've been discussing this of between sort of 10k and 50k per unit in terms of habitat units. But certainly the sort of discussions that we've been having, we're seeing it sort of beginning to find some clarity around sort of 25,000 to 28,000 per unit for, say, neutral grassland, which again I think is quite useful for those wanting to make decisions as to whether this is a viable opportunity. And that those sort of figures would tally with DEFRA's assessment of the size of the market, where they'd said it would be about 65 million for 2,600 units per annum, which comes to 25,000 per unit. We've spoken about statutory credits, Tristan has, and I completely agree with what he was saying about, I think this is very much going to be last resort and unlikely to be used. But what is interesting for the work I'm doing is it certainly sets a ceiling price. So it's quite a useful context for that. And the cost of implementation, it is very scheme specific, but there has been various research done by collaborative groups that have indicated the costs at about £10,000 per unit over the term, applying a net present value calculation. So again, in terms of the price of the units, that needs to take the costs of implementing and maintaining it for 30 years, together with all those monitoring and other costs we've spoken about. There are also the sort of professional costs for handling the legal agreements and brokering the units, which need to be taken into account. The impact on land values, again, a bit of a concern for some of those wanting to enter this space, where you've obviously got these restrictions on the way the land can be used, and that will have an impact on land value. And it's really sort of understanding what that might be. But there's certainly been discussions that potentially up to sort of 40% discount on the land value post scheme implementation, which is a consideration for some owners. Together with the sort of taxation side, primarily this, as I say, for private farmers and landowners is a consideration around inheritance tax and whether agricultural property relief and business property relief will be available. That's, I think, encouraging quite a few of them to come up with schemes that keep an element of agriculture within the habitat management and monitoring plans. So don't be surprised if you see them coming forwards with neutral grassland schemes which keep an element of grazing, because that helps them deliver that agricultural element that might be important for their own tax planning. But if there's some clarity on that coming out from HMRC, then they might be more open for doing more different types of biodiversity provision as part of their HMMPs. I think sort of relevant to this audience, also being aware that there's likely to be a stamp duty payable on rent and premiums, together with VAT being chargeable on the BNG units or credits. And I think we've touched on this earlier, but what happens to the site after 30 years? We're certainly advising clients that they're not going to be reverting back to arable land if that's what it was before these schemes were implemented. What might happen, and I think it was one of the questions in the chat, is actually these landscapes will develop and evolve. There might be further ability for sort of uplift in biodiversity terms, and we might see another tranche of sort of sales of further enhanced biodiversity and unit creation. Again, Tristan's touched a little on the legal framework. I don't think it's live yet, but we are anticipating the register coming live, and sites will need to be registered to be able for units to be sold and for them to actually sit as part of the biodiversity plan and provision. We understand that the applications for land to join the registers is likely to take up to 6 weeks, and there'll be a fee of up to £1,000 to register those sites. And to be able to register, they'll need their site-specific habitat management plan in place. And as I mentioned, I know some local authorities are creating their own registers, like Buckinghamshire are. In terms of how the agreements are then formalised, as we say, most local planning authorities seem to be going down the Section 106 route to document the offsite BNG, which is a legal agreement between the LPA and the offsite BNG provider. Some local authorities are looking to conservation covenants, but this does require a responsible body who will be responsible for enforcing the BNG. And as Tristan mentioned, there are currently no entities putting themselves forwards within Oxfordshire. So Section 106 is likely to be the route. There was a question about enforcement. Where you've got a responsible body under a conservation covenant, they will be responsible for enforcing. Where it's by Section 106, then I believe that the planning authority will take on that enforcement element. However, BNG will be a line on a property's title. So as and when property is sold, those BNG requirements and implementation may be picked up as part of that sale process. Alongside the Section 106 or conservation covenant, there will also be a purchasing agreement between the developer and the BNG unit provider, which really deals with the sort of the payment, the financial side of the unit transaction. And what we have might be worth noting for this audience is where local authorities are bringing forward their own land as habitat bank, they're likely to need a special purchase vehicle, an SPV, to separate the responsible body or Section 106 signatory from the fact that they are also the BNG provider. So that seems to be the structure we're seeing. So I'm afraid this is a shameless plug for the Savills Environmental Exchange. This is really a platform that we're using to help connect buyers and sellers of natural capital, both BNG, but also things like nutrient credits and anything else that might be needed, skylark plots, ute transfer schemes, etc. It's free to use and there's no commitment, and it's really designed to connect buyers and sellers of natural capital via our natural capital team. However, as I mentioned, we are working with lots of landowners and farmers who would like to enter the off-site habitat bank space. But I think it's the uncertainty over whether there will be a fire that is actually putting them off even incurring the expense of doing the sort of baseline assessments and preparing the habitat management and monitoring plan. So if you are struggling, or either someone, a developer that you're acting for is struggling to find someone, then do talk to us, because we will be able to find someone, particularly if there is a known purchaser of those units that can give them the confidence to proceed. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. That was very interesting. In the interest of time, I suggest, Julian, that we run straight on into your presentation, and then we know whatever time we've got left, we can take the questions, which are still coming in the chat, but they are slowing down a bit. So that's why I think we pause the questions and come back to them at the end. So Julian is an ecologist consultant specialising in technical planning and aspects of land use change and assessment. So off you go. We're currently seeing speaker view. That's it, fab. You're on mute.
Sorry, rookie mistake. So yeah, this is very much from a practitioner's perspective. I'm going to be reinforcing, as you'd probably expect, some of the themes that have come out in the other three presentations already. So yeah, I'm an ecology consultant, work a lot with developers. Been working with Biodiversity Net Gain, or its predecessors, since 2012, when it first started as the DEPA No Net Loss pilot. I'm going to talk about two projects that are very different in terms of their approach and the approach to Biodiversity Net Gain. I'm going to first put some potentially controversial, but not that controversial, statements up on the screen. This is the first one. Yeah, you probably heard something along these lines already, but it came up in one of the questions. So
the slide hasn't moved forward. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So why have I said that? Well, it's often the first thing my clients ask me. How are we going to achieve Biodiversity Net Gain? We're worried it's going to cost so much. It's going to affect viability. My answer to that is, well, yeah, Biodiversity Net Gain, it's a tool. There are other policies out there. There's a question, I think it was Eleanor that asked earlier. There are other policies that dictate what development really should look like, and Pete said earlier, there's other requirements that sites are required to deliver. Developers obviously know this, but they're obviously a bit worried, and understandably. So I've been trying to help focus their minds on the fact that BNG isn't the be all and end all. It is a tool, but the sooner you start using it, again, I think it was something Pete said, the more you know, the better armed you'll be in terms of how you're going to deal with BNG. Next one is, it doesn't have to be on site. So that's the other thing I hear a lot, and it's like, well, and some policy does push you in that direction as well, that I've seen, some local policy. As has been said already, there are some requirements for BNG. You have to have adopted the mitigation hierarchy. Biodiversity hierarchy is also important, but if you do follow those rules and you can fulfill those, then off-site is in some instances a good way forward. And in terms of good, how's that defined? Well, from a biodiversity perspective, it might be better than trying to shoehorn your biodiversity into the corner of a site where it's probably going to be under quite a lot of pressure. If it's a housing development, there'll be people, there'll be dogs, lots of trampling. Off-site may well be a better outcome for biodiversity. There's local nature recovery strategies which are dictating where Biodiversity Net Gain ideally should go, and the metric actually encourages you to choose those sort of areas. There's an uplift, not a huge one, but there is an uplift. And those areas are likely to be more or deliver more gains for biodiversity than some development sites. So that is something I also say to my clients. However, offsite can be expensive, so these things have to be weighed up. So I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies. This isn't in your patch. It's in Warwickshire. It's a site called Meon Vale that I've worked on for a very long time, and Warwickshire were part of the DEFRA pilot for biodiversity offsetting. So their pilot, their approach used a metric. It was very similar to the statutory metric that we're now using. So the principles are the same. And this is an interesting site. It's an old MOD site, 190 hectares. The developer, St Modwin, wanted to construct mixed-use development, 1,050 units, so big. And there are a number of issues here, but the good thing about this site is it's been built virtually. All the green infrastructure and habitat work's been completed, and we use the metric to inform what we did, and we've got some monitoring data, so we can actually confirm whether what we thought was going to happen is actually happened or is on target to happen, because some of these things take a while when you're creating habitats or restoring habitats. So the issues we had on this site were pretty unique, and not all development sites are going to be like this. As a result of the issues, there was space to play with, and species rich or important or high distinctiveness habitats that are going to deliver biodiversity units tend to need space. So on this site, we had some plantation woodland, which you can see my cursor, hopefully you can. It's pretty obvious, it's there. There was also some floodplain on the site, which was actually around here and into what the developer ideally would like to have built on. So that they work quite closely with the Environment Agency to actually look at relocating the floodplain, which they could do by lowering the land, and that was going to go up here.
I'm not actually seeing your cursor.
You can't see the cursor. Okay, sorry. Well, I'll have to describe it. So it's up at the north end of the site where you can see those 3 big sheds. It's just to the west of those. The 7 hectare area is going to be lowered for flood attenuation. We also had some mostly poor or low distinctiveness grassland, but there were some pockets of grassland that where there were records of some more interesting species, plus our survey showed some more interesting species as well. But one thing to bear in mind, the biodiversity metric only deals in habitats, and it would become ridiculously complicated if it dealt with all the fauna as well. It uses habitats as a proxy for biodiversity, so the better the habitat, the more likely you're going to get interesting fauna using them as well. But for this site, we also had some species issues that were quite important and are very influential on the design, and they were water voles. There's only 2 or 3 populations known in Warwickshire, so they were pretty rare at county level, and they were using the network of streams and ditches. The streams and ditches were all pretty heavily modified, some of them concrete lined, some of them in culvert, not great. The MOD obviously had modified them to suit their needs. There was also quite a lot of bat species on the site, not in high numbers, but some quite rare species that we picked up. So there was a lot to work with. So in order to get to where we wanted to be with this site, and we did get acknowledged. We got you can see the bottom corner there on the right. We actually won an award for this one, which I was pretty pleased about because I seem to have spent a good chunk of my life working on this. But one of the main things that actually benefited the outcome of this scheme was collaboration, and that was early involvement with the design team, so that things like Biodiversity Net Gain we could factor into the green infrastructure and our approach to habitats and species and how we were going to address those. But also collaboration with the local authority. Warwickshire have a quite well-resourced ecology team, and we work very closely with them, not least because, and this is still the case now, not least because the metric they were using was quite new, and we were having to feel our way with them. So there was a very much partnership. But like I said earlier, that we used the metric as a tool to demonstrate that what we were doing was actually achieving gains, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The metric didn't dictate the design. I think that's the key thing. So this is on the left is what the site looks like as of last year, and you can see in the top of the image to the left, there's a big area of wetland that's been created. So you can see a wiggly line, which is the watercourse that was linear and straight and in concrete, that's been broken out and meandered through this 7-hectare flood meadow. There's two wetlands there. The engineers, when they first their first concept for this was to lower the level and make it grassland and sort of parkland, and this is where having an early involvement was really valuable, because we said, well, there's a really great opportunity here because there's not a lot of wetland in this part of Warwickshire. It just so happens that wetland will score you quite high in the metric. It's a great habitat to create, and so what we and from a fauna perspective, it's obviously going to be great for water voles. It's going to encourage some species that really aren't that well known in this part of Warwickshire, so water birds, waders, ducks, and a big one actually. And it goes back to the question that was asked earlier. There was a policy controlling what this site was going to eventually deliver, and one part of that policy was the need to include a greenway which linked up Stratford on Avon, and you can see a kind of white line cutting all the way from south to north. That's a cycleway and footway that goes all the way up to Stratford. So public access and amenity, good green infrastructure isn't just about biodiversity. It's about what you do with water. It's about what you do, what the people do, and their well-being, their access to nature. I mean, this, from my point of view, was a brilliant sort of canvas to work on, because not only have we got a walkway and a cycleway, but we've got this wetland that we've created. The eastern side, the right hand side is enclosed by the watercourse. That's publicly accessible. The western side is visible from the greenway but isn't publicly accessible, and as a result we've got a sort of secluded area for birds and a non-secluded area, if you like, where you can get closer to the water. What also we did was included so you can see the wetland there actually, in of those 4 photos it's the bottom left. It's pretty well established now. The greenway is the bottom right. You can see someone pushing a pram next to some suds. Suds are big thing for me. This was a nicely designed one. They're not all they don't all look like that. I'm sure you've seen some bad examples like me. Also some interpretation material on the fence. There's a few of these plaques just to say what we've done and why. So because people often ask, and they often ask, why you haven't cut the grass. So it's just to kind of head those sort of questions off and create a sense of place and ownership. And the top left image there is the woodland where it was plantation woodland. It was all very uniform, never been managed, and we created some rides through it, and did some understory planting along the rides, which again will deliver some credits or units in your metric, but it's now really well used. The public, the people who live there really enjoy that space. So this is just some headlines. So we actually restored some grassland as well through a LEMP management, more sympathetically. There was a 7-hectare flood meadow, the woodland enhanced access, and we restored some of the watercourses. And at the end of this, the metric demonstrated 38% gain in biodiversity units, which is a lot, and that's obviously in more than 10. Which is what the statute will say as of next week. It's probably worth saying that there was an opportunity there for St Maudwin to potentially trade some of their surplus units. They haven't done that yet. They still could, because obviously they've created them. And it's probably also worth saying that we've now, through monitoring, which is controlled through the 106 and landscape ecological management plan, we've got some data which confirms that the metric we're either on track, or they've actually the habitats are in the condition we thought they would, some of them earlier than we thought they might be. So that's grassland, that's the wetland predominantly. So just as I say, it is, the metric's about habitats, but on this site we had some benefits for other things as well. So that's actually a Beckstein's bat, which was a first for the county, which we picked up in one of the bat boxes we put up. That wasn't recorded when we did our baseline surveys. That's Skylark in the bottom left, which is using the 7 hectare flood meadow. Wasn't on the site previously, so that's nice. There's a nice water vole eating a blackberry in the middle. We had to put up a couple of bat houses, which have been occupied. Well, one of them has, the other one hasn't, but it's interesting the kind of conversations that's generated with the public. There's quite a lot of engagement between St Modwyn and the public, and it all brings to the sort of forefront why we've done certain things, and that there's a good feeling about what's being done there, and ownership of the green infrastructure especially. And the bottom right there, that's a little ring plover which was not on the site before, and that was attracted by the wetland and their nesting, which is great. Very different site. So this one is in your patch. This is in West Oxfordshire, just outside Witney. It's a large grazed grassland field, low distinctiveness habitat. So not scoring highly in the metric. We've got some boundary tree lines, they're outgrown hedges, and some defunct hedges you can see in the middle of the field, which are quite nice, mature willow pollards and some bits of hawthorn. And then to the northeast, there's a river, and then beyond that, an old gravel pit, which is now a lake. So the site's actually also in the lower Windrush Valley conservation target area. So it's in the metric that counts for something. That means it's in there's an uplift in terms of the value of the site. So when we first looked at this, so allowing for the mitigation hierarchy, there isn't a great deal there in terms of the grassland that would prevent development. But we did say at the outset, the quantum that they were thinking of developing is unlikely to meet, or it's unlikely we would be able to deliver net gains on that site. The reason for that is even low distinctiveness habitats, if you have enough of them, it's going to be a challenge to deliver your 10% biodiversity net gain. So we did raise that at the outset with the developer, and they tested a few layouts, and so this is the final one that got planning. It actually went to appeal, but not on Ecology. So as you can see, there as for most developments, and actually there's quite a lot of green infrastructure compared to most developments, most housing developments. There was a flood issue. We can see that blue shading, and there was a need for attenuation of surface water. So the usual things dictating what the green infrastructure was likely to look like. For this, again, we were careful to adhere to the mitigation hierarchy. And then in terms of the green spaces, the green infrastructure, I think one of the messages I would say here is that you don't need to be too ambitious. That is going to be working quite hard, that green infrastructure, because people are going to be on there, and they'll be playing, walking dogs, etc. And having too much informal open space, or thinking that you're going to be delivering something that's going to be very good condition, is unlikely to be realised, just because of the nature of the development. So there is a need to be cautionary, which is what we did. We put that into the metric, and we worked with the ecologist. And there was a bit of toing and froing there. I mean, I think this is something that will be the case for some time, probably forever, with the metric, just because, as Pete said, there is an element of subjectivity to it. But we did our best within the multifunctional green infrastructure. It was obviously doing other things, but what we established was that we weren't, as we predicted, going to deliver 10% net gain on site. So that meant, well, we need to look off site, and we needed it of the order of 8 units of biodiversity, which at that point we advised that they're about 25 to 30,000 for if we were going to go through TOE. If you know them, if you're in Oxfordshire, you might have heard of the Trust for Oxfordshire Environment. So they're one of the providers of units in Oxfordshire. That comes to a bill of between 200 and 240,000, so significant. Significant enough for the developer to talk to the landowner and say, have you got any other land? And it just so happens they did or do nearby. So we actually did some work for them just to test what the potential of those or of that land was for offsetting their own impact effectively. But that involved some soil testing. It's arable land, so you'd expect the nutrient levels to be quite high, which means the potential to deliver high quality or high distinctiveness habitat is reduced. So you're looking at quite a low level, but given the amount they would have needed to purchase credits, they thought it was worth looking at. And then, yeah, just in terms of the mechanism, as has been said already, so offsite required the section 106 to be worded in such a way to be able to deliver that. On-site delivery was controlled by condition and the landscape ecological management plan, which sets out what the habitat creation would be and how it would be monitored. So that's just a couple of examples. These are the sort of take home, I guess, key points for success from what we've learned in the last sort of 10 or so years doing this. So early involvement is really important. You can understand, if you're a developer, clearly, you can understand what the implications of BNG are going to be. Are you going to need to look off-site? Like Pete says, if you've got a site that's already of high ecological value, it's probably going to dissuade you from doing very much. You might want to become a biodiversity unit provider, but developing it might be difficult. But then that's always been the case. Policies should always have directed developers away from high value sites, or hopefully they do. Collaboration with the LPA. Now, not everyone has Tristan in-house. Not all planning authorities have the luxury of that skill set. So our experience is it can be quite difficult to speak to someone who knows enough about it just to get a consensus, but it doesn't stop us trying, because we generally feel that that's likely to result in the better outcomes. As I said at the outset, biodiversity is just one of the elements of green infrastructure. So you need to consider the others as well to demonstrate good design, and things like building with nature. That's a great manual, if you like, or toolkit for what good looks like in green infrastructure. And if you don't know about that, I would definitely recommend you look at that. As Tristan said as well, the importance of the mitigation and biodiversity hierarchy, and also the trading rules, which I'm not sure how much we talked about today, but there's certain things the metric won't allow you to do. You can't create something of lower distinctiveness to replace something of higher distinctiveness, as a general rule. The metric's great as a guide, but shouldn't dictate design. Is a strong point, I think. Be realistic about what you can deliver. I've heard quite a few optimistic, if you like, consultants then falling foul later down the line of the metric not actually delivering what they said it would, and that's things like end use. We've talked about residential. There's some issues there, soil type, and things like disturbance as well. All of those dictate what you're going to be able to deliver. We talked about offsite. That one thing we haven't talked about is expertise during construction. So clerk of works, it's all very well doing this on paper, but if you don't have the right expertise on hand when you're actually putting those spades in the ground, it can all unravel quite quickly. And we've had a site where we were creating some grassland that was going to be high distinctiveness, hopefully in time, but they put topsoil on it, which would is higher nutrients, and that means that all of a sudden that is unlikely to be achieved. So yeah, that expertise during construction, which is why we all like to have conditions controlling construction, environmental management plans, and that sort of thing. And then finally, monitoring, the importance of that. We touched on that already. the proof of the pudding and all that is obviously proved once you've been to site and done some survey work, the frequency of which I think Tristan touched on already, to be confirmed. But we've been obviously monitoring, or saying we're going to monitor, for a long time prior to Biodiversity Net Gain. So that's not a new thing. But I know as a consultant that pre-Biodiversity Net Gain, it didn't happen very often. So that's just the sad reality of it. So yeah, that's my presentation. Very happy to take questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed, Julian. So let's just recap where we've got to in terms of questions in the chat. There was a question saying, sorry if I missed it, but what does one unit represent? Is a unit defined anywhere? Now, Peter, you did sort of start with the ABC, so I'm just going to ask you to recap for us. What does a unit represent?
There's not really an easy answer to what one unit represents. It depends on the type of habitat, the condition, that all those factors determine the number of units. So there's not a simple definition of a unit.
Is one way of saying it is just like a pound is a unit of money, and a habitat is a unit of habitat. And it's just that. It's just that we have three types of them. We have hedgerow, habitat, and watercourse, and you can't trade your pounds across them. So you've got three different types of currency. We've got some questions about SANG, and now where did that go in the chat? SANG and habitat and BNG, and whether you can have SANG and BNG at the same time. Now, Mike Barry has begun to answer that, saying look at Guildford guidance, but I thought it would be worth asking the panel if anyone's got anything to say about SANG and BNG. Julian, you're nodding. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think the answer is you can deliver BNG within a SANG, but, and there is quite a big but, in the first instance, you have to satisfy, if you don't know what SANGs are, by the way, I probably ought to say that first. SANGs are mitigation for impacts of increased disturbance, that is people and pets, within special protection areas for birds, generally, not always, but generally for special protection areas for birds, of which there are a few in your patch. Thames Basin heaths, you probably heard of. So that's a special protection area for ground nesting birds, and ground nesting birds are disturbed by people walking, especially if they've got dogs. The purpose of a SANG is to create effectively a country park where people would go in instead of going to the SPA, so less likely to disturb the birds. That's the whole principle behind it. That's in simple terms. A bit more to it than that, but that's it's putting it simply. So the habitats regulations are the piece of legislation that protects special protection areas. If you're creating a SANG, it's to satisfy the regulations. And now I think it was established in case law. The SANG has some very specific criteria, and someone had mentioned, look at the Guildford SPD. There's usually an SPD which sets out what a SANG should comprise of, and it's quite prescriptive, and it's got to feel kind of semi-natural. So once you've done that, if you design your SANG, it's a semi-natural space. If you can do something additional, so you satisfy the habitat regulations, but if you can do something additional that the SANG regulations or guidance doesn't require, that additional element can count towards biodiversity net gain. And we have done that elsewhere, but it really is dictated by the site. We've had a couple of sites where it worked quite well, and others where actually it didn't really deliver very much. So it's very much dependent on the site. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And we've got another discussion going on in the chat about the relationship between local nature recovery strategies and BNG, and offsite should be in the LNRS, except that should dictate where it happens. And there's some discussion, but again, I wonder which panelists would like to. Tristan, you commented in the chat, but I'm wondering if there's anything any of the panelists would like. Peter, you've got your hand up.
But just very quickly, yes, in theory, it would be great if that happens. because the LNRS is trying to identify the areas where it had most impact. But of course, it depends on whether there's any landowners within the LNRS who wants to create habitat banks or do offsetting. So you could end up, in theory, you can have a situation where you have an LNRS map which says this is where you should do biodiversity offsetting, but no landowner within that LNRS comes forward to do it. So in theory, yes, but in practice, it may not happen. It probably will, but again, it's all down to the market.
Okay. And back to some techie stuff. In terms of validation, is there likely to be anything which sets out the level and detail of information required between minor and major applications? That's probably one for you, Tristan.
Sure. There won't be, to my understanding, much of a distinction between minor and major development. When minor becomes, the statutory framework becomes binding for minor development from April 2nd onwards. The validation requirements, they're set out in the draft PPG, and they're common between those two types of applications, and it's a statement whether you think your development is captured by the biodiversity gain condition. It's information related to the baseline habitats, anything proposed where the significant on-site habitats, any information relating to degradation, etc. There's sort of a bullet pointed list there, but those will apply equally.
Excellent. Good. I think the last one in the chat is guidance on trading units. It would be interesting to, in some circumstances, to deliver large meaningful schemes which have multiple benefits rather than pure BNG plus 10 plus 10 plus 10. Or I don't quite understand that. I don't know whether the panel do. Or do you want to just put your mic on and I'll...
Hello. Yes, so I guess my question is, instead of delivering 3 sites with 10% BNG, could you have circumstances where it's more interesting to deliver a large scheme and the other 2 sites you accept that they don't deliver BNG by some way of trading?
Who'd like to answer that? You're all avoiding eye contact as if you can do that on Teams, but you can. I can see.
I'll take it. Oh, Peter,
go on, Tristan. You go first.
Yes, in theory, that's absolutely fine. If you think that there would be a shared net gain burden of the development that you wanted on the 3 parcels of land, the idea that you don't have to distribute the net gain evenly between the 3 of them, that you could have one area where the net gain is focused on delivery, and that does most of the heavy lifting. In principle, that's fine. There would be probably some complexities tying the land to specific planning applications as they came forward. I can imagine, I can almost hear the planning lawyers having a little bit of a sweat there. So otherwise it would depend on, are there any differences between those 3 bits of land? Is one spatially significant where the others aren't? So there'd be various things to take into account, but in principle, no problem.
Peter, do you want to add to that, or would you?
No, I was going to say much same thing. In principle, yes, but the complexity I think would be with it's not something someone's going to start doing in March. I don't think. Perhaps after a year or 2 of BNG, people might start thinking like that. But yeah, early days, everyone's going to keep it. Let's just do what we think we know we need to do.
And presumably, it would be helped if that sort of thinking could be tied down in a local plan and have it as a requirement that site X will have to take the BNG for sites Y and Z, which then might encourage landowners to think creatively. I don't know, I'll just put that out. Some sideways shaking of heads, which means, yeah, maybe, but actually who pays attention to local plans and they're so slow. Let's not get into that. Right, so I've got a question which is about, a number of you have said, and I agree with you, that the BNG should not dictate the design. The design should, should design your strategy for what you want nature to do and what you want the rest of the site to do, and then you do your BNG. But it doesn't always happen in practice. And sometimes that's because the conversations are happening, the developer is going away and sorting out its problems and assuming that it's got a problem with BNG, and it might not be able to make some change because it actually leads to losing quite a nice habitat on the site, even though in the longer term there might be a better link up. You know, these things are quite complicated. How do we make sure that those unintended consequences don't come through? How do we get across the message that BNG is not the system for dealing with all the ecology? You want to have that strategy and that framework, and then use BNG as a delivery tool, not the strategic tool. Peter?
To be honest, this has been one of my bugbears from the outset, so it's good feedback. I think the reality is, particularly in the early days of BNG, is because it's a legal requirement to meet your BNG target, the focus is going to be on using the metric to design the scheme, because you just want it's points, mean, prizes. So hopefully over time that might change, but I think inevitably from at the beginning, could we just be focused on trying to achieve their 10% BNG, and it will be about how do you. Sometimes it will end up, you know, how do you shoehorn a bit of habitat into a site to tick that box? It's where local plan policy really comes into play, and local plan policy should be trying to make sure that that isn't the approach. But again, it comes down to whether the statutory requirement effectively trumps local plan policy. I think most developers will be as fixated on the statutory requirement.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We'll have to see how that plays out. Does anyone else on the panel want to comment on that?
I would just add my agreement about the importance of local plans and thinking about, do they acknowledge that net gain might not be delivered on site? Do they require net gain to be on site if they make the provision, or they don't try too heavily to incentivize it on site and allow for it to go elsewhere, and then use other policies around green infrastructure, urban greening factor, other policies related to ecological enhancements to ensure higher quality standards of development through those tools instead, or as well. But it's, I agree with Peter, it's unfortunately in the first instance, I think there's going to be the great rush to try and meet the requirements.
Well, we're coming close to the end of our time. I'd just like to ask the panelists if there's any last thing that you would like to share with our still extremely well attended seminar, which is fabulous. So I'm just going to go around the screen as I see you. So Sophie, is there any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
I think the sooner we have clarity on things like the monitoring requirement, costs, registration process, the more we'll see the off-site provision come forwards. And there are farmers and landowners who are keen to do it and keen to do it properly, but they need the confidence in the market to move forwards.
Peter.
Yeah, I guess it's just a couple of observations. Is that to date, there's sort of a good example of BNG, and Julian's identified a couple with projects he looked at. They tend to be greenfield sites out of town, where, to be honest, it's relatively easy to meet your BNG. I think we've got to recognise that most development occurs on smaller sites within existing urban areas, where the amount of land is much smaller. And just to follow that thought through, I think when small site stuff comes on stream, that's going to get quite complicated and messy.
So we might need to reconvene at that point. Tristan, any last thoughts from you?
80%. I meaningfully challenge 80% of all metrics I'm presented with. And it's time consuming and a real battle, and it really tests the patience of my planning colleagues, who are fortunately very indulgent and keen to ensure that things are done right. But the theoretical framework has advanced ahead of the practical ability to deliver it. So it's a cautionary warning, I'm afraid. And
Julian, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, it's actually linked to what Tristan said. I think we're all learning, and we're having to learn pretty quickly, obviously. And just something I mentioned in my presentation about collaboration. It's something I talk about a lot, and the audience here, a lot from planning authority background. I mean, I'd really encourage it. I think that there's it's going to be a lot easier to get through and let this bed in if we're collaborating and talking. Appreciate everyone's really busy, but I think it's probably going to save time in the long run.
Good. Well, I found that fascinating. I know a fair bit about BNG, but I've learned a lot today, and it's also really useful just to have the framework re-provided to you to remember the basics as to how this whole thing works. Really informative. Maura, do you want to share the results of the poll, and we'll see how many people actually were already knew something about BNG and whatever, if we can quickly.
Yeah.
This is again
Not
perhaps
share them with everybody.
we're used to Zoom, where we can just share a poll and it gives the answer to everyone. So perhaps we need to learn how to do that.
You can click on polls, maybe you'll be able to see it.
I couldn't see it. I could just answer it because I just tried that. Unless I try the double click. Oh, view results. Let's try that. Oh, yes, I see. We all do it ourselves. So we can do it. If you go to the poll and click on the 3 dots at the bottom, you can see view results. So 78% of people were familiar with BNG. Just under half have had to use it. Are you confident? Yes, completely, 10%. A little bit, no to 22%. A little bit is 68%. Oh, that's not so bad. Have you used the metric for BNG? No, most people have not yet used the metric. Oh, well, Joy is awaiting many people. And will you be using the metric for BNG now in the future? Yes, well, Joy is really awaiting many people. So thank you all very much to our speakers. Thank you all for coming. We've had a question in the chat about whether there's a BOBMK BNG group, and the answer is no, not yet, but we never know, because actually the interconnection between wildlife design, if I can put it that, and urban design is finally really coming together, and we really need to make sure that we are not doing these things in silos and properly integrating them. Maura is reminding us all that we have a little survey, please, in the chat for you to evaluate the webinar. And thank you all very much for coming. And I don't need to wish you a safe journey home, and I hope you've had your lunch. So on with your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, you kept that quiet.
I did, didn't I? We evict people on Teams. Remove from meeting. There we go.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good. We survived.
Oh, let's stop recording.